So I'd like to do something today which may exemplify my favorite rabbi joke, and that is the following. You may not think this is funny, but it's my favorite rabbi joke. And it goes like this. What is the difference between a good rabbi and a bad rabbi? So a good rabbi has the ability to connect any two things. And a bad rabbi will actually do it. So that's my favorite rabbi joke. And the reason I like it so much because it's just so absolutely true. And so I'm going to prove to you today what a bad rabbi I am. And now, sometimes it's artificial. So, for instance, as a former shul rabbi, you know, you have a certain message that you want to communicate to your congregation. Everybody's misbehaving, and everybody's getting drunk at Kiddush. So you want to address that issue. Or the Kiddush Club is a better example. And so it happens to be whatever the parsha is, it doesn't matter. You'll find something in that parsha, and the rabbi will connect it to somehow the existence of the Kiddush Club. So he's just proven himself to be a bad rabbi. He connected totally arbitrarily two things that really had nothing to do with one another. Now, of course, the rabbi will usually not admit it. He'll think actually he had Ruach HaKodesh, and he was able to discover some hidden meaning in a parsha which seems to be completely unrelated to the Kiddush existence of a Kiddush Club. And lo and behold, his eyes were opened miraculously, and he saw the connection. Now, in the case of today, I actually think I have a Ruach HaKodesh here. And two different things I've been thinking about, I seem to be very intimately connected. So let's dig into that. And I want to apologize in advance that I don't have English translations here, but we'll make do. So I want to deal with a question, a really fascinating question, which we just encountered in the weekly Torah readings a few weeks ago. And that is when the Torah gives a seemingly totally meaningless list of the descendants of Esav, including towards the end a list of the kings who ruled over Esav. Absolutely uninteresting, a complete mystery as to why those passages should be there. And the passage begins, the specific one they're going to deal with is the first source here, Ve'ela hamlachim asher malchu be'eretz Edom lifnei Beloch melech lifnei Yisrael. These are the kings that ruled in the land of Edom before there ruled a king over Bnei Israel. That's the pasuk. And it goes on to list a bunch of names of kings. And like I said before, completely meaningless, hard to understand what it's doing there. Now, I'd just like to show you how this question is not a heretical question I'm asking. It's something which is perplexed Jewish thinkers throughout the ages. So we're just going to skip a little bit ahead here and just show you the how perplexing this particular issue was. And I'll start with a sort of unlikely source here, which is the Zohar. So the Zohar says the following. By the way, this is a Hebrew translation of the Aramaic Zohar. There was a Rav Ashlag who lived in Sfat in the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, and he made a translation of the Zohar and a kind of a commentary. It's called the Sulam. It's very popular. So he says the following: Katuv ve'ela hamalachim asher malchu be'eretz Edom lifnei Beloch melech lifnei Yisrael. So quotes our verse: these are the kings that ruled over Eretz Edom before there ruled a king over Bnei Israel. And the Zohar goes on. Ashreichem atzadikim shenitgalu lachem sodei sodot shel Torah. Happy and fortunate are you,
Yeah, but
tzaddik.
it's dead. It's dead. Well,
Why is it dirty?
well, clean it.
It's clean.
Who's ever has their microphone on should shut it. There we go. You realize how we can become privy to all the great secrets of your home if you're not careful here, closing your microphones here. So how fortunate are the tzaddikim that has been revealed to them the secret of the secrets of the Torah. She'ena mitgalim l'kedoshim ha'elyonim tahanu l'malachim. These secrets are not even revealed to the highest holy ones, the angels. Mi yashgiach bazeh mi yizkeh bazeh. Bazeh katuv ve'ela malachim. Who could possibly reach this high level of understanding to achieve the meaning of this verse? And these are the kings of Edom. And it goes on in this praise that there are these tzaddikim that have achieved an understanding of this passage, which is seemingly utterly meaningless. So in the Zohar, this verse and the continuation is a metaphor for the Sodei HaSodot, the innermost secrets. Well, that's a reflection of the fact that the Zohar thinks that this is a particularly impenetrable passage in the Torah to understand why it's there. And if I hope this is not sacrilegious, but if we can, in the same breath, quote from the Zohar and from the Moreh Nevuchim of the great Rambam. The Rambam also uses this passage as the paradigm of a seemingly utterly meaningless passage in the Torah. Look what he says here, Moreh Nevuchim. Yishkan devarim shem secret Torah. There are passages in the Torah which are secret Torah, the secrets of the Torah. By the way, it's interesting. The Zohar uses almost the exact same language. Sodei Sodot, Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam's great philosophical work, Guide for the Flex, secret Torah, the secret of Torah. Gam Kain Kvar Yishalu Behem Rabim. Excuse me?
If you had to date the Zohar, what date would you put on that?
Oh, you want me to risk my place in the world to come right now? So, right, traditionally described Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, academics associated with the early Middle Ages, Moshe de Leon. That's a whole big issue right there. Okay, and Bruce would be happy to give a shiur on that some other time.
No,
So,
it's very old, in other words.
I'm just pointing out that this classical work of Jewish mysticism sees our passage as the paradigm of a completely mysterious passage. And the Moreh Nevuchim also, he says that they're placed in the Torah, they're secret Torah, the secret Torah. Many people have stumbled over these passages, and they have to be explained. And he goes on to give an example. What are the example? We'll skip down 3 lines. The kings which ruled over Eretz Edom. That's a paradigm of an utterly befuddling passage in the Torah. What's it doing there? Completely irrelevant and apparently meaningless. Of course, now everybody's going to go back and try to explain what it's doing there, right? So since we're in the Rambam, I'll tell you what he says. You can decide for yourself if you're happy with this. So because we're a little pressed for time, we have a lot to do today. I'll just paraphrase what he says here. So we know that the Torah prohibits appointing a king over the Jewish people who are not from Israel. You have to be interesting, in American law, you have to be born in America to be president of the United States. So that's a Torah law, right? That the Torah says you shall not appoint over yourself a ish nochri, a foreigner, who's not from your brothers. So the Rambam explains that the Torah wants to give you an example of what happens if you're not careful who you have as kings over you. And he points out, if you look at this list of the kings over Edom, that in fact, they were not native Edomites, these particular kings. And as a result of that, there was extreme chaos and suffering at the hands of these Edomite kings who didn't originally come from Edom. And I'll just paraphrase a thought he says here at the end, in which we don't have time to discuss it, but it's really fascinating. He says, if we knew world history better, we would understand Torah better. This is a very contemporary kind of sensibility. And he points out that only if you really know the political history of what was going on in Edom and how much chaos and suffering was brought about as a result of these particular Edomite rulers, then we would know why this passage is so important in order to appreciate the prohibition of appointing a foreigner as king over the Jewish people. So it's a very contemporary kind of sensibility here. And he says that that's the reason. It's a history lesson in order to help us appreciate the prohibition of appointing a king over the Jewish people who is not from your brothers, as the Torah says. Okay, so that's the approach of the Mor Nevuchim. Now, in terms of the Zohar asks the same question, right? What's this doing here? And happy are you, fortunate are you, who have achieved insight that even the angels have been unable to achieve, and that is to understand this meaning of this passage. I'm not going to explain to you, according to the Zohar, what the meaning is. Let's just suffice it to say that the Zohar thinks that this passage about Edomite kings is actually telling you about the primordial mystical history of the universe. And we'll leave it at that.
Can I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Every single word in the Torah has to be explained. It can't be just telling you history. I mean,
Yeah, the assumption is that the Torah is every word is meaningful. It's not just a history lesson. It's not a science lesson. It's there to tell you something absolutely critical. That's the normative assumption about the Torah. That's the normative assumption about the Torah. Okay. Let's take a look at...
Can you say the exact opposite of what you said before? The kings are so stable and so powerful, and therefore you might want to establish a non-Jewish king, but don't do it. Not that they were weak or scattered or whatever, they're all messed up and don't pick. Who would pick up a bad king from a messed up kingdom? Don't take a powerful leader from a foreign power, because that's not what the Torah wants.
No, well, I'm not sure if I understand your question. That the Rambam claims, if you know the history of this particular period, you would see that kings who came from foreign countries that then ruled over Edom became Edomite kings that resulted in political chaos and a terrible life for the people of Edom. Right? So once you know that information, partly fed by this passage in the Torah, you'll better appreciate the reason for the mitzvah of not appointing a king who's not from a native born.
I was suggesting the exact opposite. They might have great stability and great wealth. And if you come to think, oh, you too want one of their kings to make you prosperous and safe, don't do that. I mean, no one's going to pick a king from a messed up kingdom that's going to lead to chaos. But you might think the exact opposite. Don't take a stable, wealthy, brilliant leader from a foreign country, because that's not what the Torah wants. God wants you to pick a Jewish leader.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I understand your question. The Rambam says it's axiomatic that the result of having foreign kings was disastrous, because if we understood that passage about the history of these Edomite kings, that's what we would read those psukim and say, yeah, I remember that period, and I read it in the history books, what a disaster it was. So, and that reinforces and helps me to appreciate this prohibition on having a foreign king. Okay, so I understand your question because it's predicated upon an assumption. The wrong assumption is that ancient peoples knew the history of the Edomite kings, and this reminds them why not to have an Edomite king over the Jews, for instance. Okay, now there are many other ways of understanding the reason that this list is here. I just want to show you a few of them. The most common way of explaining it, I would say a more shot orientation, would be, first of all, a literary approach. And that is, we often see these lists when we're reaching the end of an epoch in kind of biblical history. So when we reach the end of the tracing from Adam, for instance, first human being, until Noah, right? Then the Torah has a list, a genealogical list. That's the way the Torah kind of sums up a certain period and tells you now we're entering into another epoch, which is Noah, and the post-Diluvian, I think there's such a word, period in world history. And then we'll have a list again, which will take us from until Avraham, right? We're opening up a new episode. So the fact that this list appears here of the descendants of Esav, including these Edomite kings, that's all Esav. So that's to tell you this whole epic of Yakube and Esav. So Esav, we're done with him. We're done. And now we're entering into a new period of history. So from a literary point of view, that is the most typical use of these kinds of lists. But there's something even more significant, and this is something that we see many of them forcing point out, including a modern Parshan, Nahum Sarna, who I really recommend. I'm not sure exactly if ArtScroll would publish Nahum Sarna's commentary on the Torah. He was a professor, had an academic approach, and he wrote a book called Understanding Genesis. He also published the Jewish Publication Society volumes on the Chumash, which, if you're interested in kind of a modern academic approach towards the Torah, I recommend that 5-volume set, the Jewish Publication Society commentary on the Torah, and he published the Breshit volume, Nahum Sarna. So he points out that it's not just summarizing a period. There's actually a theological message, and that is to show you God's hidden guiding hand in history. It's not just the end of an epoch, but it's showing you how God's promises have been fulfilled. So it's the end of an epoch and showing the actualization of prophecy, God's prophecy. There's divine providence. So I'll give you an example of that. So we have the passage in the Torah in which Hashem had promised to Abraham. God said, we have here this source 1 Aleph, that I will multiply you greatly, and I'm going to make you into nations. Kings will come from you. So Rashi right there says, what is this? I'm going to make nations out of you. Kings will come from you. Rashi says, Yisrael ve'Edom. Right? Which Nahum Sarna thinks is the simple meaning of that passage. So when you have these two great empires of sorts, these competing empires of Yisrael ve'Edom, so now we see we're closing the epic of Edom, of the Esav, and we're showing how the divine promise of creating kings out of that, an empire, came true.
Isn't it easier to go with the Peshat that it's Yitzchak and Ishmael? Why is he jumping to Esau?
Yeah. So you're asking about Rashi. What is Rashi? Yeah, I'll tell you why. I think why. Because the fact that the Torah promises umalachim mimcha yetzeu, kings. So we don't have the same type of literary equivalent in the Torah itself of kings of Yishmael, right? If we were writing it, we could talk about the Islamic conquest, etc. But right, that's not what appears in rabbinic literature, and certainly in the Torah, right? So the fact that we have this list of Malchei Edom works very well as the promise fulfilled of Umalachim Mimcha Yitzeu. Okay, so that's Nachum Sarna points out, right? It's just the end of a period, but more than that, it's showing that history has a kind of divine providential guiding hand. So the same exact approach is taken in just a different manner, and that is the fact that we know that there emerged out of the womb of Rivka, Yakube, and Esav, and we know something about what God was told, and that is Ulaom Milaom Ye'ematz, that there's going to be this competition between these two nations, which will emerge from the womb of Rivka, and each nation will overpower the other. And that's the Midrash Rabbah explains what that means, that they cannot coexist with equal power. When one is up, one is down. A little pressed for time, but we won't look at the Midrash Rabbah. It's a very famous idea. As Rashi says, Kashezeh kam ze nofel. When one rises, the other one falls. So this notion of that they can't coexist with equal power, when one rises, one falls, that's this verse. Because what does the verse say? These are the kings which ruled over Edom before there ruled a king over Bnei Israel. Meaning, as soon as there was a king in Bnei Israel, there was some kind of cessation of the kings of Edom. So it's a fulfillment of that promise, right, in the spirit of Nachum Sarna, that there will be a kind of seesaw relationship between the kings of Edom and the kings of Israel. These kings ruled until there's a Jewish king. As soon as a Jewish king, no more Edomite kings, at least not with this nearly with the same kind of power.
Does this idea have a prophetic message for Jews who are going to accept the Torah, that they're going to see these kings become kings before they are kings? So it's a prophecy.
Okay, you're asking a different question we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And that is, wait a second, there's a more serious problem here. And that is, this is written in the time of presumably Moshe Rabbeinu. And there are no Jewish kings. So what's this a reference to? So we'll get that in just a minute. You'll see. Okay. Now, there's another approach, which is also in the spirit of Nachum Sarna, that it's the end of an epoch, but more significantly, the fulfillment of promise. And what's that promise? So the Ramban takes this approach. These are the kings who ruled in the land of Edom before they ruled the king over Israel. What's it here for? This is to show us that God's promises were fulfilled. What's that? So these the blessing that came out of Yitzchak's mouth became prophetic and it was fulfilled. What is that? Al charbacha tichya. You live by your sword. So these Edomite kings are these fierce warrior chieftains, and the Torah mentions this to show you that indeed, that in fact, Esav would be a warrior nation. Okay, so that's all along the lines of the end of an era and fulfillment of divine promises. Okay, now I want to deal with another question. Now that we have some approaches why it's here, right? It's here to show the end of an era and fulfillment of the divine promises, or according to the Rambam, it's to help us understand why we're not supposed to have a foreigner as king over us. And according to the Zohar, it's revealing the secrets of the history of the cosmos, whatever that is. I want to take a look at perhaps a more serious question, and that is what Bruce alluded to. So it says, these are the kings who ruled over Esav before there ruled a king over Israel. Now, wait a second. When was this written? Who is this king who ruled over Israel? Now, I'll ask you a simple question. Who's the first king who ruled over Israel? Shaul. Shaul, right? So Shaul, that's a bit serious problem. Right? What Moshe is writing about Shaul? A little strange. So we once discussed this. Spinoza says that this notion that Moshe wrote the Torah is utterly ridiculous. If you remember, we discussed this at length, that Spinoza claims that Moshe wrote a book, but it was a very short book. And what we have now called the Torah is not the book that Moshe wrote. There may be very small amounts of it that were in the original Torah that are contained in our Torah, but they have very little relationship one to the other. And he tries to argue that the Ibn Ezra holds of such an opinion. And he brings the selections from Ibn Ezra, which he thinks allude to that notion. And then on his own, Spinoza says, I'll give you other sources which indicate this. And our verse here, these are the kings who ruled over Edom before he ruled the king over Israel. He says, obviously, the person who wrote that was not living during the time of the 40 years after the Exodus from Egypt. He's living post a Jewish king. We'll just read that one little sentence there towards the end here. And he says, hang on a second. Right, just the last sentence here in the English here. In these few words, he hints, it also shows that it was not Moses who wrote the Pentateuch, but someone who lived long after him. And further, that the book which Moses wrote was something different than that now extant. And then he goes on, and for this I have a Hebrew translation. This is not Ibn Ezra. This is him speaking Spinoza. He says, and I'll strengthen the point. When it says these are the kings who ruled over Edom, before ruled over a king in Israel, Lilo Safek, without any doubt, historion mevi et malchei Edom lifnei shenichbasha ayedei David. The historian, the author of that passage in the Torah, the historian, right, is not Moshe. It's not God, right? The historian who wrote that, he is writing about the kings of Edom before Edom was conquered by David. K'moshe katuv, v'yasem be'Edom nitzivim, b'chol Edom, sam nitzivim, v'hi kol Edom avadim leDavid. It says explicitly in the book of Shmuel Bet that David conquered Edom. He disposed of the monarchy of Edom, and he appointed nitzivim, kind of a minor bureaucrats who would administer Edom, avadim leDavid, but subservient to David. So Spinoza, there's a certain logic to what Spinoza is saying. Spinoza was not an idiot, right? That the biblical history of the cessation of the kings of Edom is with David, really. So our verse is alluding to David conquering Edom and having these bureaucrats who are subservient to him in charge. So barur keshemesh b'tzoharaim, it is clear like the sun at high noon. Ki hachumash lo nitchaber bidei Moshe, that the Chumash was not composed by Moshe. Kim bidei ish acharei shechai dorot rabim acharei Moshe. It's written by somebody who lived many generations after Moshe. And according to Spinoza, though he doesn't say it right here, but somebody who lived at the time around Ezra, after the return from Babylonian exile. Okay, now, of course, we all know that Spinoza got into a lot of trouble for this. He was put into Cherem. It is interesting to note that the Ibn Ezra himself does deal with this problem. And let's take a look at how the Ibn Ezra deals with this problem. Now, one might have thought, based upon the respect that Spinoza had for the Ibn Ezra and how he attributes to Ibn Ezra this notion that much of the Torah is post-Mosaic, Ibn Ezra actually says, these are the kings who ruled over Edom before they ruled the king over Israel. So he says, there are those who wrote that it must be that this was written prophetically. Now, I believe that Bruce said that a few minutes ago. Prophetic. It is talking about David. And this is the verse, right? When Yaakov goes up, Edom goes down. So there's Edom is up, then David comes, he's up, Edom is down. But how could that be in the Torah? Simple, it's prophecy.
Isn't that the same machlokes that you have at the end of the Torah, where the Moshe goes his own death or the prophecy?
I'm sorry, it was a little, I couldn't hear so well.
At the end of the Torah, when you list you say,
Yeah. Very good. It's the same issue. How could there be passages with describe Moses' death, etc.? So this is the same type of issue, 100%. I just want to show you that none other than Rashi, when the Ibn Ezra says that some say this must have been written prophetically, that's Rashi's approach. So take a look at Rashi. Ela Melachim, these are the kings. Shemana Shmona Hayu, there were 8 of them. Ukenegdan Hemid Yaakov. And Yaakov, in fact, established 8 kings, right, eventually, meaning Israel, parallel to the 8 kings of Edom. So you see how Rashi is taking this notion of when Yaakov is up, Edom is down, in a really kind of poetic sense of 8 versus 8, right? 8 kings that are listed here in Breshit, and then 8 Jewish kings who are up, and when they're up, Esav is down. Ubitel Malchut Esav Bimehem. And the 8 Jewish kings, all that time that they existed, from David on, there are, actually just from Shaul on, that the Malchut of Edom was destroyed. Beluhain, he gives you the names of all the 8 Jewish kings, and he points out that after 8 Jewish kings, Edom rebels. This is actually based on an explicit pasuk in Malachim Bet, that Edom did rebel and they reestablished their kingdom after 8 Jewish kings. So there's this perfect seesaw. When Edom is up, Yaakov is down. When Yaakov is up, Esav, Edom is down. I hope I said that right, but you know the words are trying to come out of my mouth. So, obvious according to Rashi, Rashi is describing something that only happens much later in history. So it's obvious that this was meant to be prophetic. So when the Ibn Ezra says, there's some people say it's prophetic, so that's a reference to Rashi and many others. But the Ibn Ezra himself doesn't really like that so much. But before he tells you his own opinion, he tells you another possible approach, which he really doesn't like. So we're back to the Ibn Ezra. Yitzchaki Amar B'Sifro. So we once saw this a long time ago. Yitzchaki said in his books, Yitzchaki was probably a Karaite, commentator on the Torah. It must have been that this parsha must have been written in the time of the king Yehoshaphat. For the same reason, interestingly enough, that Spinoza said it, it's got to be written by somebody who's looking back in history and saying, here's a list of the kings that ruled before Shaul or before David. So who's ever writing it is writing from the perspective of there's already a Malchut Yisrael. And this Yitzchaki, this Karaite scholar, says it's this particular king, Yehoshaphat. So, and then famously, the Ibn Ezra comments on this. Hachi karash mo Yitzchak. That's why his name is Yitzchak. It means laughing stock. Anybody who listens to what Yitzchak says would laugh at him. God forbid, he says, that anybody should take seriously what he said, that this was written in the time of Yehoshaphat. Sifro Ra'ui Lisaref. His book should be burned. So Ibn Ezra doesn't like this too much. And it's an interesting question, by the way, why he gets so upset about it. If Spinoza's interpretation of Ibn Ezra is correct, it's a little surprising that the Ibn Ezra would react so violently against the suggestion that this passage was written in the time of Yehoshaphat. By the way, and this is something also we want to talk about at length, there are those who try to say that the Ibn Ezra does believe in a lot of post-Mosaic editions of the Torah. So why is he so upset about Yitzchaki here, who said that this whole list of kings must come from the time of Yehoshaphat? So the Tzafnat Paneach, who's the major medieval commentator who interprets the Ibn Ezra more or less like Spinoza, says that the objection that Ibn Ezra had was not in principle, because according to Tzafnat Paneach, Ibn Ezra did believe in post-Mosaic editions. It's just that it's one thing to have a phrase, a sentence, a word that's post-Mosaic, but to have an entire chapter of the Torah that is post-Mosaic, that the Ibn Ezra could not handle, because that would be an infraction of when the Torah says, don't add to the Torah. Don't add to the Torah. You can add an explanation, right? A phrase, but not something as substantial as a whole chapter. That would be transgressing lo tosif. You're not allowed to add to the Torah. So what is this reference here according to Ibn Ezra? When was it written? Who is the king? And I find Ibn Ezra really a perplexing commentator, because in some ways he's so contemporary, and in other ways he seems to be very almost midrashic, even though he doesn't like midrash. Look at this. Vamet. So what's the truth about this pasuk here? When was it written? And who's the king? Who's the Jewish king? That after him, it marked the cessation of Edomite kings. Vamet sheperush lifnei maloch melech al Moshe melech Yisrael. You know who the king is? Moshe. It's the list of Edomite kings who ruled up to Moshe. So there's no prophecy here, like Rashi said. It's not written in the time of the Jewish kings, right? That's heresy. It's Moshe writing, looking back in recent history, that there were rulers in Edom, kings, up to his time. And that's the reference. Now, Moshe's the king? You're kidding. I've never seen Moshe. He's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's Moshe our rabbi. Moshe a prophet, king. So he says, yeah. V'chein katuv v'yi b'Yeshurun melech. When the Torah says, and there was in Yeshurun a king, the Ibn Ezra says that king referred to there, when it says in Devarim, there was in Yeshurun a melech, that's Moshe Rabbeinu. That's a little bit circular eating, because it's very far from certain that the reference to a king in that verse in Devarim, chapter 33, verse 5, where it says that there was in Yeshurun a king, very far from certain that that's a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. But the Ibn Ezra says that is Moshe Rabbeinu, who's called a king. And so therefore here, when it says, these are the kings who ruled in Edom before there ruled a king in Israel, me, Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm that king referred to here. So that's how the Ibn Ezra deals with that. It seems to be quite a stretch, and I would say it's almost midrashic, if I could accuse.
I think one of the attacks on Spinoza was that he invoked Ibn Ezra to try and support his argument. And Ibn Ezra here specifically rules it out. So that's sort of intellectually dishonest to do that, unless you didn't know it.
Yeah, 100%. So now, in all due fairness to Spinoza, he cites this passage without ascribing it to the Ibn Ezra. Because when Spinoza says, here's a great example of a passage which could not have been written in the time of Moshe, he doesn't say, and Ibn Ezra says this, he says the Ibn Ezra says this idea in other places. I, Spinoza, can give you more examples than the Ibn Ezra gave.
Yeah,
Right,
but
so-
it's sort of, there's something dishonest about the way he phrases it, I think, because he says it's just like the Ibn Ezra said about the secret of the 12 episodes that were written afterwards. So it's not just like the Ibn Ezra said, because the Ibn Ezra specifically rules this out in this case.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Now, I'll defend Ibn Ezra again. So, far be it for me to defend defend Spinoza. Sorry, Spinoza. But when Spinoza talks about the Ibn Ezra, so he says, I'm just turning back to where he talks about Ibn Ezra. It was for this reason that Ibn Ezra, a man of enlightened mind and considerable learning, who was the first, as far as I know, to call attention to the misconception, did not venture to explain his meaning openly, and expressed himself obscurely in words, which I shall here not hesitate to elucidate, making his meaning quite plain. So he accuses the Ibn Ezra of being, let's say, the first to move in this direction, but was too afraid to openly state his position, and perhaps even was overly conservative with a small c in taking to the full extent this approach of recognizing post-Mosaic additions in the Torah. I think that's how Spinoza understood Ibn Ezra. So he would say, the Ibn Ezra may not even agree with my example that I'm giving now about the kings ruled over Edom, because he was too conservative. Or maybe he believed it, didn't want to say it. And that's why he is kind of fooling us by making it sound like he's really from there, right? So I think you have to say something like that. And I agree with you.
But look at the last sentence of the passage that you brought here. He's specifically ascribing to Ibn Ezra that Ibn Ezra knew that it wasn't Moshe who wrote the Tanakh. Right?
Right.
Now, if you say that straight out, Ibn Ezra was aware of this, but he didn't have the guts to say it. And then you brought the Ibn Ezra, who specifically says, Chas v'chalila, I would ever suggest something like that. Then by stating that, you're being, to some extent, intellectually dishonest.
Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. I personally agree with you. And by the way, I don't know why I'm so fascinated by this. I'll have to discuss it with my therapist. But and I think I mentioned this once, that Professor Amos Funkenstein, who is I happen to have known him, he was one of my teachers, completely non-religious academic scholar of Judaism, died a few years ago. So he published a book on Parshanut HaMikra, the classical commentaries on the Torah, in which he calls absurd the claim that Ibn Ezra denied the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. He admits that Ibn Ezra regards certain isolated passages post-Mosaic, but so does the Talmud, as was pointed out by one of the scholars here participating in the Zoom, right? The last 8 psukim of the Torah, right? Even the Talmud says that may be post-Mosaic. So, but to suggest that Torah Moshe is not Torah Moshe, like the Spinoza describes to him, is ludicrous. By the way, if you take a look at current academic scholarship, almost without exception, they have the same attitude as Spinoza. Ibn Ezra is this great heroic figure. He paved the way for contemporary biblical scholarship, right? And fully buy into this kind of approach, even though it really makes no sense to me, as Danny also seems to make no sense to you as well. Okay, fine. Now, by the way, that doesn't necessarily prejudice how one views personally the authorship of the Torah, right? It's just a question of what did Ibn Ezra think, right? In other words, you could be buy totally into biblical criticism, but say Ibn Ezra did not deny Mosaic authorship of the Torah, right? Those are two separate questions. Okay. Now, I want to return to the question of why does this list appear? So we saw a bunch of approaches. It shows fulfillment of divine promises, end of periods in Jewish history. It's there, like the Rambam said, to explain why we're not supposed to have a foreigner as king over us. It's there in the Zohar to reveal mystical secrets, etc. We explained who, from what historical vantage point the verse was written, who's this king. It could be a reference to Shaul or David, in which case it's prophetic, or it could be that it was written already in the time of post Shaul and David, if you're not very orthodox, or it could be the Ibn Ezra's approach, that it's written in the time of Moshe and it's looking back in history, that these are kings who ruled up to the time of Moshe. Fine. I'm going to return to the first question of what is its significance? What message is sent by this list of Edomite kings? I want to show you something interesting. Now this is where I'm going to plead guilty being a bad rabbi. But I actually believe what I'm about to say. Let's look further on in the Torah. After we have the Toldot Esav, this list of the generations of Esav, including these kings of Esav, we have something that looks a lot like it immediately following that. Immediately following this list of the descendants of Esav in their sort of political history, we have the Torah saying, Vayeshiv Yakube eretz Megarei Aviv, eretz Canaan. Yaakov dwelt in the land of the sojournings of his forefathers in the land of Canaan. And then Eila Toldot Yaakov. These are the generations of Yaakov. That's the exact same expression, Eila Toldot Esav. These are the generations of Esav. That phrase is the way you begin a genealogical list. Eila Toldot. These are the generations of. The reader is primed. We've seen this expression used several times already. Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the list of the generations from Adam to Noah. This is a phrase which resonates very strongly, that we're about to see a list, and it's the end of the Torah's interest in that chapter in history. Surprisingly, something very shocking happens. Eila Toldot Yaakov. These are the generations of Yaakov. It should not be a list of names. Instead, Yosef ben Shvas Reshana Hayaroet Echav Batzon. Yosef is 17. He's a shepherding with his brothers. Blah 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 blah. Hope this sounds familiar to you. No list.
No, but in every other case, it shows the person lives a certain time, he dies, and then these are his descendants. In this case, it clearly cannot be physical descendants. He's alive.
Yeah. And furthermore, by the way, not necessarily, because sometimes the Torah gives you the impression that somebody is dead, but they're not. This is a story with Terach and Abraham, and there's a lot of other examples of that, that if you do the math, that the person lived longer, but he's irrelevant. He's irrelevant. He's in a Beit Avot in Yerushalayim watching TV all day, right? But the Torah is moving on with history. So this is jarring. Eila Toldot Yaakov, and then all of a sudden, it's one of the most famous stories in world history in literature. We call it Torah literature, right? The story of Yosef and his brothers. No list at all. So you can imagine this bothered the great commentators. Why is this narrative introduced in such an awkward and unfitting way. Eila told Yakub. We should just erase those three words and just begin. Yosef ben Shvas Reshana Hayad. Yosef was 17 and he was a nudnik, made his brothers jealous, blah, 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 the whole story, which takes us through the entire rest of the book of Breshit. So the commentators deal with this already in the Midrash. Rashi paraphrases this Midrashic approach, and look what he says here. After the Torah has listed the descendants of Esav, it's a list, no information. Boring list. So after it does that, now all of a sudden we have a long narrative with tremendous detail. Shaloyu slunim agunim v'chashuvim lefaresh each nityashvu v'seder milchmotehem eich orishu et achorim. God's not interested in telling you much more about these descendants of Esav. They're irrelevant. Piresh lecha yishuvei Yakub v'toldotav b'derech harukah. Kol gugulei sivatam. Now the Torah, when it gets into the descendants of Yakub, his family, the intrigue with Yosef and his brothers and the whole story, there the Torah all of a sudden slows down and goes into lengthy detail about all of the causal factors that led to ultimately going down to Egypt. Because Yaakov and his descendants are important before God. Larich bahem, to then discuss it at narrative length. And then he gives you this very famous analogy here, where, before he gives the analogy, he says that you find this pattern in other places where there'll be a list, very little information, like from Adam to Noach, and then it'll stop and go into detail, the story of the flood. The same thing, a list from Noach to Abraham, very little detail, and then detail about Abraham. So the Torah, in a literary fashion, is trying to tell you what's important, what's not important. And gives now the very famous analogy that it's like somebody who they had a pearl, and the pearl fell into a bunch of sand, and the person's trying to recover. Someone should turn off their mic there. It's making noise. So they're looking for the pearl in the sand, and they're using a sifting through the sand. They use the sieve, sift through a bunch of sand until they find the pearl. Once they find the pearl, then they take the pearl, and that's the focus of their attention. But all the sand, just go through it quickly. It's not important. So that's the analogy, that these lists are telling you something in a literary fashion about the relative significance from God's point of view of these other nations and generations in contrast to others. So the contrast of Noah to what came before him, the contrast of Abraham to what came before him, and the contrast of Yakub and his family compared to, and in contrast to, the lack of importance of Esav. Okay. The original Midrash that Rashi is based upon has a wonderful image. It says, imagine a child who's learning Chumash, and the child reads a list and goes through it very quickly. And then they get to an interesting story. And there they savor the story and imagine the story. Rashi left out, and it's a shame he left that out. It's a wonderful image because it's saying something the Chama Leibowitz used to say, and that is that the Torah often will communicate a message using a literary form rather than hitting you over the head with an explicit message. By having a meaningless list that you read through very quickly, and then abruptly breaking into a narrative with all kinds of interesting detail, impresses upon the mind of the reader that this list, unimportant. List of meaningless names, dates. And then the child all of a sudden gets to a story with intrigue, mystery, murder, love, everything necessary for a good story that communicates to the child without saying it explicitly. Now, here's what's important. This is what's important in history. Now, the Rashi goes on and quotes another midrash, which makes a very similar point, and it talks about someone who is a metalsmith. He makes things out of metal. He has a hammer and an anvil, and he has to have a furnace to heat the metal before he hammers it. He has a delivery truck come, according to the midrash which Rashi cites, with a bunch of flax. But the guy delivers a huge amount of flax, and the smith doesn't know what to do with it. Too much. So along comes a smart aleck and says, "What are you worried about? All that amount of flax that you don't have enough storage space for it? Because when you're hammering with your anvil and hammer, one spark from your hammer will destroy completely all of that flax. One spark will set it on fire and it's gone." Now, what's the relevance of this? So he quotes the pasuk from Avadia, that the house of Yakube will be like a flame, but Beit Esav will be like kash, like straw. One spark comes out of the flame of Yaakov and completely destroys the huge amount of flax from Esav. Same idea. This may look very scary. All of these generations of Esav and these kings, ferocious kings of Esav, very intimidating. No. The only thing that counts is Yaakov. That's what's important. And though they're small, one spark from Yaakov destroys all the flax from Esav. Now, I want to show you something. This is the central message of Hanukkah. This is where I'm a bad rabbi. But it's true. It may be true I'm a bad rabbi also, but the message is true. Right? The Torah, the Talmud describes how the Yevanim came into the Beit HaMikdash, right? They defiled everything. And there was this famous miracle of the shemen. There's only enough to burn for 1 day, burn for 8 days. So I'm sure everybody here knows the very famous question of the Beit Yosef. It's probably the most famous Talmudic question ever asked. And that is that, according to the Talmud, we observe Hanukkah for 8 days because there are 8 days of miracles. There's only enough oil to last for 1 day, but it burned for 8 days. So Beit Yosef says that makes no sense because there was enough oil for 1 day. So only 7 days were miraculous. Very fair, very super famous question. So the Beit Yosef himself answers, maybe you could say that what they did was they divided up the oil on the first day into 8 parts, and then used only 1/8 of the oil each day. But miraculously, even just using 1/8 of the oil, it burned every day, all day. So that's a famous answer to the Beit Yosef. In other words, what's he saying? The miracle was not quantitative, it was qualitative. The oil which burned, that should have been just enough to burn for a short period of time, there was a qualitative change, transformation in oil, and it burned more slowly. It burned the whole day long, even though it should have only burned for a few hours. So we thought it was a quantitative miracle, right? That the 8 days, that there was a miraculous manufacturing of new oil. No, there was some kind of miraculous transformation of the burning quality of the oil. And that's the miracle of Hanukkah. So each day was a miracle. So what's the idea there? That's a story in the Talmud. That story of Nes Pach Hashemen, which is telling you about the qualitative miracle. A little bit of oil burned a long time, miraculously long, is a metaphor, right? I want to show you how this is central to the Hanukkah story. The tribe of Levi is blessed. Beirach Hashem Chelo, Ufal Yadav Tirtzah. Hashem is going to bless with power the tribe of Levi. And they're going to stand up against their enemies. Rashi points out there, Ra'ash Atidim Chashmonayu Vanav Lilachem Ima Yevanim. So Moshe, before his death, he's seeing that the tribe of Levi, Kohanim, they're going to have to battle the Yevanim, the Greeks. He davened for them because he said, it's fun family. Yud Bet B'nei Chashmonai, Belazar, K'nei Kama Revavot. It's one family, 12 people, and they're going to do battle against the multitudes of the Yevanim. So therefore he prayed for them, that even though they're few, they'll be victorious. Because the victory is not a function of quantity, but of quality. Look what we say in the Siddur. Masart the Giburim biyad Halashim Rabim biyad Ma'atim. God, we thank you because you have given over the strong guys in the hands of the weak. That's us. Rabim biyad Ma'atim. And the multitude in the hands of the Ma'atim, few. It's the power of the few against the many. It's the power of the quality over quantity. A lot of kings of Edom, but one spark from Yakube burns them all. That's the central message of Hanukkah, is the message of the contrast between the list of the kings of Edom and the narrative of Yosef and his brothers. And we read on Shabbat Hanukkah from Zechariah, very famous, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. Don't be intimidated by quantity, by brute power. Hanukkah is quality over quantity. And as Rabbeinu Bachya in Chovot HaLevavot points out, this theme, very famous, this is the original way it's formulated. You've heard it with a slight difference, but this is the original formulation. Ma'at mina emet notzeach harbe mina sheker. A little bit of truth vanquishes much lies. Kashem shema'at mina or misalek harbe mina chashecha. Just like a little bit of light drives out much darkness. This is the original origin of that phrase, mat mina or docheh harbe mina choshech. You may have heard that phrase. This is the original location of that phrase here with a slightly different language. And that's the message of Hanukkah. A little bit of light, just a little bit. Pushes a lot of darkness. And that's the message of the contrast of these ferocious kings of Edom, many powerful, in contrast to a family. But the story stalls there. We've dispensed with Esav Edom. What's important now? Yosef and his brothers in that whole episode. That's the focus. That one little spark from the smith's hammer on the anvil destroys much flax. And that is exactly the story of Hanukkah. And it's interesting that we read these passages in conjunction around Hanukkah time. Yes, Bruce.
At the end of the day, don't get the Edomians with Herod and a whole dynasty, and they end up taking over the Jewish people.
I'm sorry, say it again.
The Edomites become Edomians. From the Edomians, you would have the house of Herod. And at the end of the day, the Herodians remove the Hashmonaim, and they become the leaders of the nation prior to the Romans. I mean, it's sort of, they kind of like get the upper hand at the end over it.
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you were, and I know you are, a man of faith and fully internalize this message, what would you say?
But as history proceeds, we will, when they were up and we were down, ultimately we'll be up and they'll be down.
Exactly, just like Ovad just said, that that there will be a flame from Beit Yaakov, and it will destroy the flax, the straw of Esau. So, with that message, we will hope for a very bright future as we become ascendant and Esau descends. And I wish everybody a very happy, qualitative, joyous